Hey guys, it's Clovis. I've been asked a few times, and a few people have brought up in different videos as a discussion point about what cards would be on a ban list if there was like an online version of Duels of the Roses, and if you played player versus player, what cards would you ban, etc. I gotta be honest, it would be like a huge thing to actually come up with a full-fledged ban list, so instead of doing that, what I'm actually going to do in this video is just, I kind of went through some things of some cards, like, I looked at cards and thought, would this be a potential ban list thingy? So, I may have missed out on some cards, there might be some cards that are broken that I didn't put in, or maybe some of the cards I picked aren't actually that broken. Some of the cards I'm going to talk about I didn't pick, but I'm going to talk about them to do with something else. So just bear with me on this video, guys. It would have been really hard to do it like a full ban list without some discussion. So feel free to let me know what you guys think about Yu-Gi-Oh! Duels of the Roses ban list in the description, what cards you guys would include. And yeah, I think it would be awesome for all of you guys and us to, you know, as a collective group to come up, you know, with the full list of like what would be the most broken cards in the game that you would ban or limit or whatever. I did want to quickly mention though about limiting, is that limiting is a bit different in this game than the real game. In this game there's no search cards to get out any card from your deck, so it makes sense to have limiting a card actually has a completely different effect. Like if you only have one card in your deck instead of three, in this game you can't search it, so it makes you way less likely to draw the card. If that one card is at the bottom of your deck, you know, which is a 1 in 40 chance, you know, it's about a 1 in 8 chance that it's at the bottom 5 cards of your deck. Which is pretty low still, but it's possible, you know, that means 1 in every 8 games you're not going to be able to play that card. If it's limited, you won't draw that card, or essentially that's what it means, because you can't search that card out from your deck. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that as a difference. So limiting instead of banning might be a more viable solution in some cases, or less viable in other cases, and that's why I brought that up. Okay, so the elephant in the room has to be Ryoka. This card has to be banned. Simply because you can do something as simple as equip Ryoka twice to a monster, play Tremendous Fire, and win. Now, you would argue, personally I'm going to argue the case as well, or not really argue in this video, but actually just say it makes more sense to set life points at 8,000, but even if you did that, you could still use 3 Ryokas and then a Tremendous Fire. Or 2, and then, you know, use Tremendous Fire, and then one that has been set already, you know, for a 2-turn kill. You know, there's no way to actually have this card in the game, even if it was limited, I don't think, as a win condition, you know, it's just, it has to be banned, this card. In saying that, you know, there will probably be a way to play around the Destiny Draw as a way to draw this card. I don't think that's the worst thing ever. I think you could possibly play around that, you know, just make sure you don't leave your opponent with less than 1,000 life points if you can afford to hit them again the next turn. It's probably a good solution. Or, you know, focus around making sure you OTK your opponent or something like that so that they don't Destiny Draw. I think that would be a fair way to keep it in the game as a Destiny Draw thing, along with Mirror Force, which, you know, maybe Mirror Force wouldn't be as good as this card in that situation, but who knows, you know, it totally depends on what you're drawing and how the game is played, but the bottom line is, this card has to go. There's no reason for this to be in it, otherwise literally everyone will just play 3 of them and they would constantly equip it and then just use burn cards to kill you or whatever. And of course, we've got to discuss the other inaccessible 99 deck cost card, Mirror Force. This card I don't think is as broken. Of course, you've got stuff like Royal Decree and I think it's Ancient Tree of Enlightenment that disable traps. Traps in this game I don't think would be nearly as strong in player versus player as they would be in the base game, because there's so many ways to actually counter them, you know, flipping them face up, or just, you know, yeah, a card like Royal Decree, I guess. Mirror Force could be potentially devastating, but you could potentially play around it. If it was, I think allowing it in the game, maybe limiting it would be okay. The reason why I wouldn't want 3 copies in the deck is that, you know, I think it will be just annoying if you had everyone playing 3 Mirror Forces. I think it would just be an annoying way to play the game, but again, it totally depends. Like, if people are playing this game online and then it was legal and no one, if it was limited and no one was playing Mirror Force, then that might say, maybe you should just let people play 3 and then see what happens, and if that's too powerful you can reduce it down again. You know, if there's a metagame, that would depend on if traps are played or not, because you can argue for or against them. Their trap cards are really good, but you can just counter them really easily, so a card like Mirror Force is a prime example of that. It's potentially very devastating, but if they shut down traps, it's absolutely useless, of course, but that will be a motive going into a lot of cards that I discuss in this video. So yeah, Royal Decree, I think this is a card that has to be allowed. You could argue the lower deck cost cards maybe could bump their deck cost stuff up if it was online, like, you know, Ancient Tree of Enlightenment, they could add way more deck cost on the effect of that if you wanted to, but cards that have effects, like monsters that have effects, you could argue that they cost summoning power to play, so it balances them out a little bit. A card like Royal Decree being so high deck cost is not too unreasonable, because you can play it at, like, on the first turn, it costs you no summoning stars, especially if you're playing like a dragon, like a high level dragon or machine deck. So imagine you play Royal Decree first turn, face down defense, move forward twice, and then the next turn you have 7 stars, you can play anything from, you know, Blue Eyes White Dragon to, I don't know, even like, if you made some of the fusion cards legal, like Red Eyes, Black Metal Dragon, you could actually theoretically play that second turn after a Royal Decree, and then the enemy wouldn't be able to use traps in reaction to it. And I think that's a pretty decent playstyle, because, again, like, if that's the way people played the game, you could be able to stop this. It wouldn't be too broken, it would just be a nice aggressive strat you could implement. People could always do something like play Harpy's Feather Duster to try and destroy your face down card first, which could eliminate this, but, you know, who knows. So yeah, speaking of Harpy's Feather Duster, of course we've got to mention this card, because it's banned in the real game, and it's been banned for a really long time. It just straight up destroys all your opponent's spells and traps, doesn't matter if they're face up, face down. But in this game it's completely different. It just destroys spells and traps that are vertical and horizontal, and that includes yours as well. But, you know, the enemy can easily play around this. They can just set their spell cards and their trap cards diagonal to each other. And, you know, that way, if you wanted to take one out, you would only be able to take one or the other if you were playing this when you're on the opposite side of the map as the opponent. So in this game, I think there's no problem with this card, really. I actually think Heavy Storm is more like what the real Harpy's Feather Duster would be. So this card, I think it's fine. Unlike, you know, the real game, it's kind of broken. The other 70 deck cost card, however, Earthshaker. This card, it shouldn't be in the game. It's just, it's way too random. It's something that I don't think it's fair if you were like in a situation where you're about to lose and you can just play this and potentially win from almost nothing. I don't particularly think that's a good design of like a card or something. If it was something that involves some strategy to set it up, like a final draw, like you had a card in your hand you're waiting for, you set some monsters up and then, I don't know, use like shift or something, sure. But Earthshaker is just too RNG. It's basically just something like a self-destruct button, or like, I call it a bullshit button. You know, if you're about to lose, you just play that, move shit around, and potentially change the course of the entire duel. Especially if you had like a Solomon's Lawbook on the field, and then you play this out of your hand, and then use Solomon's Lawbook and play something to attack your opponent's leader when all the Earthshaker stuff is moved. It also moves out Terrain and removes Labyrinth, but again, that would depend if Labyrinth is, again, like, that's a huge effect I'm thinking of, but I'm just not sure how much of a difference it would make in player versus player. It depends on if you had Labyrinth on the field, I guess. Grave Robber is, I think, a very fair card, purely because when you revive a spell or trap card, you actually can't move it when you revive it. You have to wait till the next turn. The case is different for monsters. If you revive a monster card, you can flip it up, attack with it, do anything you want with it, put in defense. The same turn you revive it, but because this is slow, it takes a turn after you play this card. I totally think Grave Robber is exempt from being banned, personally. You could maybe argue banning Mimic Out or something, but Grave Robber I think is totally fine. And I did also want to briefly discuss Diane Keto the Cure Master. We talked about, well, I mentioned 8,000 life point being the limit. That would make this a pretty interesting recovery card. There's no reason to really ban it if that was the case, that both players started with 8,000, because then, you know, at best it would recover less than half of your starting life points. So I don't think that's too unreasonable. It would be potentially the best one, you know, if you had a lot of cards where you, like, if you played the cards that you paid life points, such as the Hourglass cards, and you drop your life points below 4,000 and played this, maybe you could do it with that. Other than that, I can't imagine too many people using it, so maybe just let people play this. It's the best recovery card, I guess, but it's absolutely useless until you drop below 4,000 life points, so that adds a really interesting element to it. Magic Drain has to be one of the strongest spell cards in the game. I really underestimated it when I was young and played this game, but just the more and more I play this game, the more I acknowledge it's actually one of the strongest things ever. It really, really shuts down your opponent, and if you play around it correctly, it just allows you to play your strongest monsters way faster than you should be. It enables strategies that involve high summoning power monsters, rather than having to rely on fusions, like I guess most strategies will try to evolve to like space out their summoning power and keep it conserved. Magic Drain, however, that card would allow you to take the opponents. The thing is, though, I don't know if you would ban it because the enemy have to have summoning power to play it, so because there's some skill involved in this card, I think it would be... I think you could get away with playing 3 of these. If you limited it, then, I don't know, it would be not as great, because this would only be effective if you draw it on like the first 1, 2, or 3 turns, I would say. Until it gets to a point where if there's ever a stalemate, you can just use it to shut down your opponent. But yeah, as a shutdown card, it's quite effective, but you probably want to be playing this on the second or third turn when your opponent hasn't played a monster to just take all their summoning power. You can play something strong and still have a high amount while the enemy has none, and then they're forced to play magics and traps, if they have any traps, if they're playing them, to defend themselves from the best cards in your deck if you've drawn them. Again, Gorgon's Eye, just like other trap cards, you can counter this. There's a few other ways to counter it as well. Cards such as Magical Neutralizing Force Field, you can also Curse Breaker. If it's a monster card that you put in defense, assuming you shifted the monster in defense, I don't know why. But yeah, you can use a card like Magical Neutralizing Force Field after you trigger this to destroy it and free everything of it. So a lot of those permanent face-up trap cards are easily countable. I probably should have mentioned that when talking about Royal Decree, but I did not for some reason. But anyways, Gorgon's Eye would be really, really cool because I don't think, if you have like 8,000 life points, I don't think it's the end of the world if you have to play all of your cards in attack mode, because as long as your deck lead is protected and the enemy can't attack directly, you're actually very, very likely to have damage comparable to the enemies, no matter what deck type you're playing, if you use equips or not. I mean, if either of you use anything to purge the equips, like, you know, Magical Neutralizing Force Field, then you would both be reset to similar damage anyways. If you have 8,000 life points, I don't think it's, yeah, as I said, it's not a big deal for your cards that are in attack and you take some battle damage from those. It's more just a way to enable cards like Mirror Force, and also a very effective counter. If you're able to protect this card, that is, or play 3 of them and, you know, have them in your hand ready to play another one if it gets destroyed, is a very good way to shut down face-up defense monsters, which some of those, I think, are some of the most broken cards in the game, potentially, like Temple of Skulls, I think is one of the strongest cards in the game if you're playing like player versus player, and one of the few things that can counter it is Gorgon's Eye. Another card you could use with Gorgon's Eye would be the Dur deck, which flips everything onto attack mode. If you use that and you have this card face down, then the enemy tries to put something in defense and it doesn't work. So you can do that and then, you know, have a card like Mirror Force, and if the enemy attack you, all of their stuff is destroyed because it's all in attack mode. That's a nice strat you could do, but yeah, if you banned Mirror Force or Gorgon's Eye, then, you know, some of these cards might not be as useful because, you know, the whole point of this card is to make sure the enemy don't play defense. So yeah, without cards that take advantage of it, it's not so good. Fairy Meteor Crush, I looked at this because of Earthshaker. I was looking at cards around 50 deck costs, and Earthshaker has that random element about it where it's like a self-destruct button, but I think Fairy Meteor Crush is a different case. Even though it's like kind of random, you can just use it out of nowhere and hopefully destroy something. I don't think it's quite as bullshit as Earthshaker. I don't know. You guys might call me hypocritical for having a different opinion on this card instead of that card. I just think this one isn't as different. It doesn't move the field around, it doesn't move cards around. It just may potentially destroy 1, like, or 2, or 3. I mean, assuming you only have a few cards out on the field each, this is not even likely to hit one of them, whereas Earthshaker is extremely likely to just, you know, move cards that are in threat of you completely out the way. So yeah. Time Seal, another 50 deck cost card, I personally think is quite fair because there's quite a bit of stuff in the game that releases spellbinding. For instance, Pop the Trick and Dragon Piper. That's a very popular one. you probably know, I've got that card from Pegasus. Even Cursebreaker, although Cursebreaker is a bit of a different story because that will dispel the attack buff on the card as well, and because Time Seal is effective against, obviously, the strongest monster you have, you're assuming that it's something that's been buffed up a lot, so if you have to Cursebreaker it would get rid of it all, and maybe make it useless. You'd probably have to play something over the card that was Time Sealed if you didn't have something like, Dragon Piper. So, in that case, I do think this card is quite balanced, and at the same time, the enemy player might be summoning their own... If they're summoning their own high-power monsters, you wouldn't play Time Seal because you're likely to, stun your own stuff. So, I can imagine this being just a handy, or, I guess, annoying thing to deal with in like a stall deck or something. Something like an Exodia deck, where you're just buffing cards up and they're just playing really weak defensive stuff. So Dark Hole is a very interesting one, and the reason for that is it doesn't just destroy all monsters on the field, it actually destroys all cards on the field. So you can set this, it only makes sense to set one of them, because otherwise you would destroy, your other copies of it, but you can set this, blow up everything on the field, maybe even activate, like, Dimensionhole before, so that you're lined up against the enemy deck leader, Dark Hole the field, and then play a card out of your hand and attack your opponent directly. That's the strategy you can do with it. Is this card too broken? Yes, but that's not because of Dark Hole itself, I think. I think it's because of White Hole. White Hole... Its effect says that it cancels Dark Hole and protects all your monsters. That also works for you. If you play White Hole and then you play Dark Hole, it doesn't destroy any of your cards, so... it's literally, if you set White Hole and then play Dark Hole, then, especially if you have 3 Dark Holes and you can just keep playing them out of your hand if you've drawn them all early on, like, you have a Ryoka and Harpy's Feather Duster simultaneously, and that's just ridiculous. So, if you think, okay, it makes no sense. If you ban Dark Hole, then White Hole will be completely useless anyways, because it's one of those specific counter cards. Does that mean you have to keep Dark Hole in the game? Not really. I would like to see Dark Hole in the game and see how it does in a player versus player situation, but, like, if you guys watch my tournament, I don't really use Dark Hole that much because it kind of ruins the thing. It just completely throws off the game strategy, but I kind of like that. I think if there was, like, a deck cost system where, like, you had to match deck cost of people, like, an average deck cost around your deck, then maybe you could bump Dark Hole up to, like, 99 deck cost and then, make it alright, because then you would have to play, like, a really low deck cost deck to be able to play these. Maybe that would make it balanced, I don't know. I would like to see strategies evolving this card, but I do think it's just too strong, especially... I mean, I would personally... If you leave this in the game, obviously you have to ban White Hole. That's how I'd like to see it done. But yeah, again, like, limiting the card is a bit different, then it makes it less likely to draw the card and never play it, so... that does throw the card a bit off balance if you do that. The card, I think, is just as devastating. Definitely depends on the context. It can be more or less devastating, is Heavy Storm. This is pretty much like Harpy's Feather Duster, except it works like the real Harpy's Feather Duster, except it works on your cards as well. So it's like the real, what's it called? I guess it's like, Giant Trunade, that's a card. But also, just if it's like all the face down, it just gets destroyed instead of being put back to the hand, and it works on traps too. I don't know how to describe this card, it's just so broken. It destroys all spells and traps on the field, so if you're running a deck that only uses like those monsters with strong effects, and you just played Heavy Storm, then the enemy wouldn't be able to play any spells or traps. You'll just keep using this. You can even use monsters such as Magician of Faith or Mask of Darkness to revive this, and just play no other spell cards or trap cards, and your opponent just wouldn't actually be able to play spells or traps. Well, they would be able to activate spells on their turn, but they wouldn't be able to play anything face down. You just destroy it. So yeah, playing against a deck that relies on setting some spells and traps, it would just completely devastate them. In a way, it kind of balances the card. To play a strategy involving this card that forces you to not play, other spells or traps. You could still run spells like Solomon's Lawbook that just let you draw through your cards faster and then play Heavy Storm. And speaking of which, Solomon's Lawbook. This is a card I don't think should be banned. It's a card everyone would play 3 of because it's pretty much the pot of greed of this game. But I don't really know if, I don't know, in a game like this, I think it's a fair card. Unlike the real game, Pot of Greed is way too broken in context of the real game. It's just too much of an advantage to give you another card in your hand. In this though, it lets you play another card, so in the case of playing a Solomon's Lawbook, if you play it straight out of the hand, you're still technically only playing 1 card, you're just drawing through your deck faster, and that does sort of mill you out as well, so to say, if the enemy doesn't draw a lot, and then they stall you out a little bit, and you run out of resources if you do that. It's totally up to you and your strategy, so I think having Solomon's Lawbook at 3 would be totally fair. I think it's a card I would probably play a lot of, because, again, you can just dump anything that's low summoning power, or your spells, any trap cards you're not using, quickly play Solomon's Lawbook if you want to draw something more important. But at the same time, you know, you don't have to play the card. You could just design your deck so that it never bricks. You know, you always draw 5 cards. You just got to make sure that you can do, or you can always play something out of the 5 cards you have in your hand, no matter what 5 cards in your deck are in your hand. Stop Defense I wanted to mention because it's a very strong card, very strong effect, low deck cost. You also have the Dur deck, which is the monster card version of this pretty much, so it's effective against something like Temple of Skulls. You can't use this against Temple of Skulls because it disables, you know, spells. So that's a problem. You have to play the Dur decks to perfect to do that, and then play Gorgon's Eye with it or something. But Stop Defense is a very good card for, I guess, forcing the enemy into attack mode. I mean, if they're playing a very defensive strategy and you want to do some damage, you have some very high attack monsters, and they're just accepting their losses and putting their cards in defense mode. You can do something like play this and then, I don't know, just attack all their monsters, whatever you're close to, flip them all up and attack them and see what happens. Do a bunch of damage rather than attack in defense mode, because unfortunately there's no piercing damage in the game, so if you really want to do damage via battle, you kind of have to use a card like this or Dur deck. Darkness Approaches, this card has to be banned. It's one of the cards that's responsible for just infinite loops, like you can have multiple Magician of Faith and you can just revive them to recover this, as well as another card, and just infinitely revive spell cards from yours or the opponent's graveyard, literally infinitely, you know, until your cards, your Magician of Faiths are destroyed. So I think it would just be better if you just didn't have this game. If you just didn't, like, if this was banned, it would just make it a lot more smoother to play. You wouldn't have to worry about people having these stupid strategies that revolve around duplicating spell cards. That's all I have to say about it. Dimensionhole. So this is pretty interesting. You can do a lot of interesting stuff with this. I want to mention maybe limiting this is a good idea, so you could only play 1 of these per turn. That's something that I really should have mentioned with a lot of these cards, but most of the effects aren't really effective twice in the same turn. But this one, what you can do is move yourself aggressively and then defensively. You can move yourself in, play a card to attack directly, and if that doesn't finish the job, you can defensively Dimensionhole out of there. So this card will be pretty interesting. Maybe it'll be good as like a finishing move. You would have it in your hand, play it, and then you have a Solomon's Lawbook that you've set. You can flip that up and then, you know, try and finish your opponent off like that. I think that'll be a pretty cool way, like a pretty cool, interesting strategy to see if people play just 1 Dimensionhole in their deck for, like, the sake of mobility. I think it's cool to have an option like that. I think mobility makes for a better game, especially considering this game has the movement element to it, unlike the real game. You can move around on the field. I think it would be cool to have, you know, the monsters, the effects, the spell effects that allow you to move around and take advantage of the aspect of the game. So the problem I have with Dark Piercing Light is that it's too cheap and it does way too much. Flipping up cards in this game just does way too much. I talked before about countering a trap cards with Royal Decree. This is another way to counter trap cards. You just use this to flip them all face up, and then A, you know what they are, B, they cannot move, and C, you can play Magical Neutralizing Force Field and destroy all of them. So this just makes trap cards really weak, as well as disables enemies' monster flip effects. It just does so much. I mean, and for any position-based spells like the previously mentioned Dimensionhole, like, I don't know, even a terrain card, or like Harpy's Feather Duster, it disables them from being moved if for whatever reason the player sets them and intends to move them more than once away from the tile they're at. It ruins the day for them as well, but we're also forgetting the main intention of the card, which is just to give information of the enemy. If this card gave information of the enemy's cards but didn't disable all of that shit and all flip effects and stuff, then maybe it'll be, you know, a bit more balanced. I mean, it'll be totally balanced if you did that. It would kind of be underpowered, actually, but this just does way too much for what it is. It's a 15 deck cost spell, you know, it costs no summoning power to use it. Everyone will play 3 of these, right? Because then you know what all the enemy cards are, it will disable all traps, blah 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 blah, everything I mentioned pretty much. So, I would probably, if there was like the deck cost system, as I mentioned before, I would just bump this way up to like, I don't know, 50, 60, maybe even 70 or 80 deck cost, really. It depends how it stacks up with Swords of Revealing Light, if you want to leave that in the game. So, power-ups in this game are part of the reason why it's so broken, but here is a great idea I have for power-ups. Make them all limited to 1. Why? Well, pretty much all the archetypes have more than 1 power-up they can use on their monsters, so I think it's actually very fair to limit them all to 1, because if you think in the case like females, they still have all the 3 female equipped spells plus whatever their original unique types are. That gives you an incentive to play female cards and female archetypes. It also gives you an incentive to play different strategies based on how effective power-ups are. So, for instance, if you're playing a light strategy, you could play Maha Violo, flip up all your, you know, every time, if that's in face-up defense, you can increase all your power-ups, and you can use that a lot. You could really, if power-ups are that much of a problem, you could ban it, but there's so much stuff in the game that dispels, like Curse Breaker and Magical Neutralizing Force Field, that you wouldn't ban, that I think it's totally fine to have power-ups, but considering there's so many different power-ups, I just think it would be a really cool, really creative way, and really fair and balanced way. Like, I just think it makes a lot of sense if you limit all of the power-ups to 1. You still have Megamorph you can chuck in any deck, so, you know, for instance, with a zombie, you would have Violet Crystal, Megamorph, and Dark Energy, but you could also have, for instance, Crush card. Even if it's high deck cost, you could chuck that in depending on if you wanted to use it or not. You could also use Horn of the Unicorn, the condition being that you would not be able to use that on any of your zombies except a few of them, including Skelgon, which is actually one of the strongest fusion ones you can play. But I think it's a very fair way to keep power-ups in the game. I'm not sure if you guys agree or not, but I think it's a pretty cool idea, and it's just also a cool excuse to use stuff like, you know, having different cards in a Fiend deck. Like, you could have Malevolent Nuzzler, Dark Energy, Horn of the Unicorn. Did I say Fiend's Castle? There's some I'm missing, like Malevolent Nuzzler. Yeah, I think I probably already said that, but anyways. So, when I was actually getting back to Mimicat and Monster Reborn to talk about why they're a bit more broken than Grave Robber, because they revive monsters that can use their flip effects on that turn, or attack that turn, it makes them a lot stronger with that. Call of the Grave is one of the reasons why I feel like it's fair to have those in the game. I know I talked a lot about how you can counter trap cards, but I mean, it's kind of rock, paper, scissors here. You know, you can counter trap cards, but trap cards can counter certain magic cards. You can shut down magic cards, but I mean, I would really hope Temple Skulls would be banned, so your only solution would be to play multiple magic jammers if you were to shut down magic cards, but this specifically targets some of the best ones. You know, Monster Reborn and Mimicat are 2 of the best spells in the game, and Grave Robber's pretty good as well, right? Especially if that's going to be left at 3 in the game, would probably be a pretty valuable way to get spells back if you're banning some of the other spell revival cards. But yeah, in saying that, Call the Grave, if people were really afraid of the enemy being able to abuse revival resources, if that was a problem, that's exactly why this card would be in the game. So if this didn't suffice, I mean, maybe they'll be too strong. You can keep this at 3 and then limit the other revival cards. That way, if people play these, it would be likely that, you know, that you would be able to draw this first, which would kind of make the other cards useless, unless, you know, if they had a card that had, like, a deck, sorry, that had, like, Monster Reborns or revolved around reviving stuff, they would be forced to play a strategy that shuts down traps. And I think that's fair, because, you know, that forces more creativity into the build, having to, like, implement your strategy and your archetype with your power-ups and everything, while still fitting in these options. So now onto monsters. I'm going to talk about the ones which have the most powerful effects, I guess, and then some other ones. This one, however, doesn't have a single effect. Mystical Elf, though, has an effect. It increases all your light cards by 800 points. I think it's even all light cards on the field, I'm not too sure. But that is a problem, because you can have 3 of them. You can also fuse to make them with either this card, Dancing Elf, or Wing Egg Elf, if you fuse that with a female that's below 800 attack. This is a problem because it costs you 1 star, and it's so versatile. Like, I don't know, I think Dancing Elf is just too strong as a card, honestly. I know you guys are thinking, what the hell, it's like the weakest card in the game, but you can make Mystical Elf out of it, you can make any 1-star female fusion out of it, you know, you can make Nekagao with this, you can make Queen of Autumn Leaves. I'm pretty sure I'm missing another one, maybe, potentially, but again, obviously we're talking about, yeah, I mean, you can even make yeah, Dark Witch with this, if you fuse this. Well, that would make Mystical Elf, I guess, if it was that weak, but you guys get my point. You make Mystical Elf with this, and you can make it for so much stuff. It's so cheap. You can just stick 3. Everyone would play 3 of these in any deck if it wasn't, like, you know, limited or banned. So, this is a card I would actually consider limiting or banning. So Magician of Faith would probably come up to a few people's minds about monsters that should be banned. This is the reason why I'm banning or wanting to ban Darkness Approaches, is that so you can actually have cards like Magician of Faith. You can have them at 3 because you have to play a strong spell card, or your enemy has to play a strong spell card or trap card for you to actually get any use out of this. Also in saying that when you revive a spell or trap, you have to wait till next turn to activate it, so it's actually not too fast. It would also be a nice little, you know, it's versatile. You can actually keep this in for a fusion, and it will be fine because, you know, Dancing Elves banned, so you don't have to worry about, you know, spamming Mystical Elves and, like, using a strategy that replicates Monster Reborns and then plays Dancing Elf over this to play Mystical Elf, flip its effect up, and then Monster Reborn over it to give your, like, Mystical Elves just infinite damage. Like, that strategy should never be a thing. So yeah, banning cards like Dancing Elf and banning Darkness Approaches, I think, is great because it allows you to actually play cards like these, which promotes more creative strategies. So Muka Muka is a card where you can just play it out of your hand and it does a shit ton of damage provided you've already dumped a lot of monsters into the graveyard. Unfortunately, I think this effect is too strong. I just think the damage is way high. If this was like a modded online thing and you could patch things and change things, you could maybe reduce it, but I think the 300 per monster is too much. Any strategy that involved fusions would result in being able to play this and OTK your opponent within the first 3 or 4 turns of just fusing stuff and walking towards your opponent. And I think that's a bit of a shitty way to play, personally. Yeah, you flip this up and it just gets max damage quite easily, and yeah, it's stupid. Again, I did choose to ban Darkness Approaches and cards like that, but I still don't think that it makes this card fair at all. And limiting it wouldn't make a difference either because, you know, you would still, if you're running a fusion strategy, you'd mill through your deck pretty fast. You'd cycle through your deck very, very fast, actually, so you'd always end up getting to this. Gate Dig is interesting because it's 3 stars. It's different to Baphomet, okay? That's why I didn't bring up that card, really, when talking about bans. So, considering you start and at the start of your turn you regenerate 3 summoning points, you're always able to play this card out of your hand. So if you have a set Solomon's Law book and you draw this, you can actually play any card out of your hand. Also, if you've actually set one of these face down and then later on you can play a Solomon's Law book, or any amount of Solomon's Law books and any amount of Gate Digs to just play a bunch of 12-star, you know, anywhere up to 12-star, theoretically, if there wasn't any 12-star cards in your hand, up to that number you want in that turn. And that's a pretty weird way to play. It does require a lot of setup. I just think this card is a bit too strong because it gives you plus 12 for free. It's different with Baphomet because that's 5 stars. It's not particularly too strong like a fusion. It's not, you can't use it for Summon Skull. I could argue that card is, you know, it's harder to play and it costs more, so it's a bit more balanced. This is just free out of your hand. You can just play it, and if you have any other cards that take advantage of it, well, yeah, so. Temple of Skulls, I'm not a fan of. I would accept someone arguing it should be left in the game, because it would, again, force you to not play any spell cards, or force you to use a strategy that doesn't play spells. but I just think the effect is way too strong. It's very, very difficult to deal with unless you have the Dur deck, so again, that would always tie into the metagame, you know, how useful is this card compared to the Dur deck? Would people be forced to play multiple Dur decks so that they didn't lose to this card? Would that ruin people? Would that just make the game, you know, more homogenized and everyone would be playing the same shit? In that case, I think just get rid of this card, it's better so people don't have to force random stuff into their deck to have to play around it. Winged Reflection is the only flip monster that lets you draw a new card. It's, I think, the only, well, Skelangel works if you attack the opponent, but that's assuming, you know, you're not going to lose a fatal amount of life points in doing that, or, you know, the enemy has to also have a monster next to your Skelangel for you to revive it and attack it with. This card, however, if you have Monster Reborn, you can, or Mimicat, you can revive it from either graveyard, flip it up, and draw a card, and that's a pretty interesting element to it. You can also use it to cycle through cards, and unlike Solomon's Lawbook, it costs 4 stars, but Solomon's Lawbook is a spell unlike this, so you can't revive it and use it in the same turn you draw it, so I think it's tit for tat here. I wouldn't ban this actually because it has an advantage but disadvantage over Solomon's Lawbook. I would have to see this card played to really determine how broken it is. The Stern Mystic, again, talking about Dark Piercing Light. I don't know, I personally think an ability that flips everything on the field face up is a bit too powerful. I would raise the deck cost of this heavily, or just straight up ban this card. I think there's so many light spellcasters that you can afford to just get rid of this card, and it wouldn't be like there's anything missing, especially if you still had, like Dark Piercing Light and Swords of Revealing Light were limited or something. You wouldn't have to use this card. I just think it's a more fair way to play. I know I mentioned the fact that monsters have summoning power does lay into the effect, but I don't know, I think you just afford to just ban this card. So, I now want to talk about some of the ritual cards. I think some of them could be, like, some of the unobtainable rituals and fusions could be implemented into the game seamlessly, and I would say, let's unban these cards, you know, let's give ourselves these cards that Konami wanted to hide from us in the single-player campaign from the start. Serpent Knight Dragon, again, you look at a card like Mikazuki no Yaiba, Red Eyes Black Dragon, all these high-level, high-attack Dark Dragons, they're not really, it's not really unreasonable to play. Like, if you had 3 of these in your deck, that wouldn't be a problem. It has a strong effect, sure, but only if you're against spellcasters. So it'd be a nice, you know, pocket card to have in your deck if, you know, oh, you're playing against spellcasters and you're running Dark Dragons. Maybe just play this instead of, you know, your Red Eyes or your Mikazuki no Yaiba or whatever Black Skull Dragon you're playing if you're running that deck. But I mean, what I mean is, like, if you have to play, if this is a 7-star card and has 2350 attack, I don't think it's unreasonable to legalize this card. And in saying that, I mean, I can mention a lot of cards like Performance of Sword, Mask of Shine and Dark. I think a lot of these are viable candidates to be free into the game, to be at 3. This is a perfect example, I think. It's 7 stars, it has a power-up effect that powers up your light monsters by 3 stars. I don't think it's that broken to have 3 of these in your deck, because you have to play a 7-star card 3 times. I actually think if you had 3 of these, people wouldn't play these. Because they're so expensive, actually, and they're a high deck cost too, if that would factor into it. But I mean, that as well as the bonus against Fiends would make this more viable to play. You could also even run a Sword and Shield strat so that you flip the attack and defense of this card, because its defense is a little bit better. And in that case, you know, you could add like Yellow Luster Shield, and that would be a fun time, you know, like playing 1, 2, or 3 Yellow Shield, depending on, you know, if you end up limiting the card because of Sword and Shield Yellow Luster strategies. But anyways, yeah, it'd be a cool way to play this card. And, you know, no one's going to Ritual Summon it, especially if you nerfed the ability to bring out multiple mystical elves, like by banning Dancing Elf or whatever, or limiting that card, or whatever you do to that. So yeah, but, I mean, I would love this card in the game because I think it's fucking awesome, it just looks cool, and if you didn't have this card, then no one would play any of the other Light Warrior cards, because there's only 3 of them, so they would have no support. It'd be useless to play other Light cards like Fairies or whatever, that'd just be way better. But what do you guys think about Cosmo Queen? Very strong effect. I would consider this, but I mean, it's 8 stars. It actually costs like quite a bit to play this. I know I mentioned strategies revolving for instance, Magic Drain, but I mean, I think cards like these are the reason why you ban a card like Gate Dig, because it's just devastating if you play this out of your hand and you're able to summon it. Imagine if this card was legal, you would have to really play lots of spells and traps and force yourself to build your summoning power up to play it. And then, you stick power-ups on it, it's 8 stars, and there's no way to reduce it for spellcasters, so I think that plays into how powerful the card actually is despite its effect. Maybe, as I said, with a card like Skull Guardian, maybe it's just too expensive for people to actually bother to play it. Who knows? On the contrary, it's a female card as well. You could power-up stack the shit out of this, especially with, like, Maha Vilo, if that's legal, but who knows. It will be... A lot of these cards, it's really hard to tell how strong they would actually be without seeing them played. So I mentioned Great Moth because this card you'd never see in the game unless you just legalized it, and then maybe Insect deck players would play it, I don't know, but I always like considering these cards when talking about, what cards you should bring into the game. Because this is way less efficient to summon than the other cards. I mean, it's still 8 stars, like Perfectly Ultimate Great Moth, but, way less attack and defense, and, what else can I say about it? I mean, it's just as inefficient to summon as Cosmo Queen, but its effect isn't as strong, I would argue. You could say the effect is pretty powerful, but again, this is a game a lot of people will be playing, like Curse Breakers, Magical Neutralizing Force Field, or just buff stacking the shit out of their monsters to a point where reducing them by 100 each turn wouldn't actually be that much of a detriment, so I think this card should be perfectly fine. You could just legalize this and have it at 3, and it wouldn't be a problem in the deck. It would just be a nice little beater to have in the hand for Insect decks, and that would allow them to maybe compete a little bit more with some other decks that have 7 or 8 star beaters. Who knows? Maybe people probably still wouldn't like this card because it's 8 stars and 2600 attack. That's not very good. And the last thing I actually want to talk about is the Immortals. I don't really know what to say about them, just the fact that they're broken, I don't know, I think some of their effects are pretty useful, but I would actually ban all the Immortal cards that didn't have interesting effects, and then, let people limit them to having 1 Immortal in their deck or something like that, because I think it will be annoying to have decks run with full Immortals. Hear me out, I just think if you're playing this game multiplayer, you just wouldn't want to play the game if everyone was playing Immortals. If Immortals were legal, people would just be playing 3 of all of them in their deck, and, the whole field, they would just smash into you. Probably play shitty cards like Mirror Force and stuff. And then, the whole field would just be a bunch of crush, and that's just not the way the game should be played, I think. I just think it's too disruptive compared to every other strategy. It just has way too much control over the game. It forces you to play their game no matter what strategy you're playing, really. With very few exceptions. Someone could probably come up with something really creative and broken, because, I mean, it's Duels of the Roses, but we're talking about a game that's regulated. We've pretty much nerfed every other, we've gutted all the other things. We've even gutted power-ups, as I said. If we limited all power-ups to 1, that would actually, fucking Immortals don't care about power-ups anyways. They already have shit power-up support, but my point is, they would just be annoying to play against, so I would already ban them on the merit of that, and then maybe have a select few that you could include into the game that would be a unique way to actually, some of the low attack ones that you couldn't really attack into stuff and just destroy, or you'll be forced to take a shit ton of damage if you did that. Maybe that's okay, Jowls of Dark Demise, people think that's the most broken card, but I don't know, if you just ban them all, I don't think anyone will be complaining, and then maybe one day after all the dust has settled and there's a more balanced metagame, you could maybe try and introduce one of these into the game and see what happens. But yeah. Alright, so I probably repeated myself a lot there, but that's pretty much all I had to say about these cards that I looked through the list and picked out and talked about. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the discussion on it, and leave your thoughts or what you guys think should be on the ban list in the description below.